I have won 3 wars, negotiated 11 treaties, and once talked a river clan chieftain down from a siege using only a cold breakfast and a list of grievances I had memorized overnight. I am, by every reasonable measure, a man who knows how to win. Bryn did not agree. Bryn, my great gray wolf, who had been my companion since he was 8 weeks old, and I was 12, who had faced every battle at my left side and every council meeting at my feet, sat in the center of my private courtyard on the second morning of Lord Eden's visit, and looked at me the way a very patient tutor looks at a student who has failed the same examination 3 times. I ignored him. I had a plan. The plan was this. Lord Eden of Greyfen was my oldest friend, my steadiest ally, and, as of 3 days ago, my direct competitor for the attention of Wren of the Hold Archive. He had arrived for the autumn summit, unattached and charming. She had been unattached and indifferent for considerably longer. The result was what I will call a situation. She had come to Aldenmere Hold 2 years ago, hired to reorganize what my former archivist had left in a state I can only describe as creative. 43 years of treaty records stored by neither date nor kingdom but by the thickness of the document, which told you nothing useful when you were trying to locate the Fenmark border agreement before a council session. She had fixed it in 6 weeks. She had also, on the 7th week, handed me a misfiled ledger with a note attached that read, "The Westmere trade figures for the past decade have been in the war record drawer. I have moved them. You may want to review the past decade of Westmere decisions." I had reviewed them. 2 of the decisions needed correcting. I was not used to being corrected. I found I did not mind. Bryn had noticed that I spent a great deal of time in the archive after that. He had said nothing. Wolves rarely do. But his ears had begun to track in a direction I recognized, and did not examine closely. Lord Eden had noticed her at the welcome feast, which was not surprising. Wren was not beautiful in the way that stopped a room, but she was the kind of person a room reorganized itself around, without anyone noticing, until it had already happened. She had been sitting at the far end of the lower table, working on a document she had clearly brought from the archive, eating a piece of bread with the focused calm of someone who found both the feast and the assembled council entirely beside the point. Eden had watched her for 10 minutes and then said, "Who is that?" "The archivist," I said, in a tone I intended to convey that the matter was settled. Eden is the best reader of people I have ever met. He heard everything I did not say, and his expression shifted into something I liked considerably less than his usual warmth. "Ah," he said, and then he went and introduced himself. I watched my oldest friend charm the woman I had been quietly, carefully, not at all obviously failing to court for 8 months, and something in my chest did something I did not have a good name for. Bryn, who had followed me to the feast against custom, and was sitting under the table, put his chin on my boot. I pretended not to notice. 3 days of competition followed. I say competition, though Wren would have disputed the word had she known about it, because she was not competing. She was simply being herself, which was the problem. Eden brought her a book from the Greyfen archives she had apparently been trying to locate for years. She thanked him in the tone of someone who has received a useful tool. He offered to show her Greyfen's cataloging system when she visited. She said she would be interested to see how they handled multi-kingdom treaty sequences, and pulled out a piece of paper to write down a question she did not want to forget. I, meanwhile, had sent to the capital city for a complete set of the Aldenmere historical records in the new bound format, which I thought she would find useful. She received them with the same tone she had used for Eden's book, pleased, specific, and entirely focused on the object rather than the gesture. She wrote me a note thanking me, and pointing out that Volume 11 appeared to be Volume 9 rebound, and I would want to raise that with the press. Edan found this funny. I did not find it funny. I found it the single most interesting response I had received to a gift in my entire life, and the distinction between those 2 reactions was the thing I had not yet worked out how to explain. Bryn had stopped sleeping in the North Pen. He had taken to waiting outside the archive door. I told myself he was cold. The archive is on the south wall of the hold, and catches the afternoon light through 3 wide windows. It is, in fact, the warmest room in the building by mid-afternoon, and Bryn has always had a weakness for warmth. This was a perfectly reasonable explanation, and I held to it firmly, until the 4th day, when I passed the archive at mid-morning, and found Bryn inside, lying in a patch of light, directly under Ren's work table, while she worked above him, apparently oblivious. I stopped in the doorway. "He came in on his own," Ren said, without looking up. "I didn't invite him." He pushed the door. "He isn't usually permitted indoors." I told him that. She turned a page. He didn't leave. I looked at Bryn. Bryn was doing the thing he does when he has made a decision and would like everyone to understand that the decision is final. His chin was on his paws, his eyes were closed. His entire enormous body communicated the relaxed certainty of a creature who has found the one place in the world where he belongs and intends to remain there indefinitely. I went back to my council meeting. That evening, Eden made her laugh. It was not a polite laugh, not the controlled social sound a person produces when a remark is adequate. It was a real one, sudden, unguarded, the kind that arrives before the person has a chance to decide whether they want it to. She put her hand over her mouth and looked surprised at herself, and the sound lasted only a moment, but I heard it from across the hall, and something landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripple pulling inward to a single point. I set down my cup. Bryn, beside me, made no sound, but he had turned his head to look at her, and then he turned it to look at me, and his expression, if a wolf can be said to have expressions, was that of someone who has been waiting for you to notice something obvious for quite some time, and is relieved you have finally arrived. I went to sleep that night, knowing two things I had not known that morning. The first was that I was not competing with Ed Dan. I had never been competing with Ed Dan. A competition implies that the outcome is uncertain, and that either party might reasonably win. What I had been doing, without knowing it, was waiting. The same way Bryn waited outside the archive door, without a name for what I was waiting for. The second thing I knew was that I had a problem, because I had no idea how to say any of this to a woman who had, on 3 separate occasions, corrected my paperwork. The argument happened the next morning. It was about the Westmere Treaty Ledger. I maintained that it was filed correctly in the 3rd drawer, which is designated for ongoing diplomatic correspondence. Ren maintains that ongoing diplomatic correspondence, which is also a binding trade agreement, belongs in the treaty sequence, cross-referenced, which is why the Westmere figures had been misfiled in the war records in the first place, because the previous archivist had not cross-referenced either. I maintain that the 3rd drawer system is the system I approved, and it is therefore correct. She maintains that a system which produces 10 years of misfiled trade decisions is not, by any useful definition, correct, regardless of who approved it. We had this argument in the Great Hall. I am not entirely sure how that happened. The argument had begun in the archive and had migrated, the way certain arguments do, through a doorway and then another doorway, and then out into the main space of the hall, where approximately 40 members of my household and one Lord Eden of Greyfen had the poor luck to be present. Eden, I noticed peripherally, had stopped pretending to read his dispatch and was watching with the focused attention of a man who has been waiting for something specific. "The 3rd drawer," I said, for the 4th time, "is where I have always kept the ongoing correspondence." "And that," Ren said, with the patience of a person who has made this point 3 times already, and is prepared to make it as many more times as necessary, is precisely the problem. The treaty sequence belongs in the 2nd cabinet, left side, in date order. If it is in the 3rd drawer, it cannot be cross-referenced, and if it cannot be cross-referenced. The hall door opened. Bryn came in at a walk, which is not how Bryn usually moves in the hall. He usually stays out of the hall, because the hall is loud and crowded, and neither of us has ever enjoyed the combination. He walked in as if the hall were empty, across the full width of the room, through the space between Ren and me, and then he sat down, on her feet, all 4 of his legs folded, his full weight committed, and he settled against her shins with the air of a creature who has been meaning to do this for some time, and is glad to have finally gotten around to it. The argument stopped. Ren looked down at Bryn. Bryn looked up at Ren. Something passed between them that I was not part of and could not interrupt. And then the mate mark came up on my left wrist, warm gold, slow as a tide, and from the small sound Ren made, I knew it was on hers too. The hall had gone the particular quiet of 40 people, all deciding at once not to speak. I looked at my wrist. I looked at hers. I looked at Bryn, who had the expression of a wolf who has solved a problem and would appreciate acknowledgement. Eden from across the hall said, "Well." He said it with the warmth of a man who is genuinely happy for his friend, and also very pleased with his own instincts. He stood, tucked his dispatch under his arm, and inclined his head in a bow that was not mocking in the slightest. "It seems I have been courting the wrong archivist." "There is no right archivist," Wren said, with considerable dignity, given the circumstances. "There is for him," Eden said. He was smiling. I had forgotten, until that moment, why I liked him. I looked at Wren, who was still looking at her wrist with the expression of a woman working through an unexpected development. She was still standing in the same spot, one boot under Bryn's considerable weight, and she made no move to free it. "I should mention," I said, "that I am aware the third drawer system is probably wrong." She looked up at me. "I filed the Westmere correspondence there myself when I was 19, I said. "The previous archivist told me I had done it correctly. I have been filing it there ever since on the assumption that he knew better than I did. I should have looked more carefully." Wren considered this for a moment. Then she said, "You could have simply said so 3 days ago." "I could have said a great many things 3 days ago," I said. The hall was still very quiet. Bryn shifted his weight slightly, comfortable. I held out my hand, palm up. Not a command, only an offer. The same offer it has always been. The only one that matters. Freely given, or not at all. She looked at my hand. She looked at Bryn, who gazed back at her with the unabashed patience of a wolf who has already decided how this ends. She looked at me, and there was something in her face that I recognized, because it was the same thing that had been in mine for 8 months without a name. Attention, finally named. She put her hand in mine. The hall breathed. Eden started clapping. My steward Raoul joined him, because Raoul has been trying to get me to do something useful about this situation since the spring, and has no remaining patience for restraint. Then the rest of the hall joined, the way halls do when something has happened that everyone was already expecting, and is simply relieved has finally arrived. Bryn stood up, shook himself once, and walked to the hearth, where he lay down in the warmth, with the settled dignity of a wolf whose work is finished. Later, when the hall had emptied, and it was only the two of us and Bryn asleep by the dying fire, Wren said, "The second cabinet, left side. I'm going to move the Westmere correspondence tonight." "Tomorrow," I said. She looked at me. "Tonight," I agreed. We moved the treaty ledger. It took 40 minutes, and she explained the cross-referencing system while we worked, and I listened to every word, because I have found that listening to her is one of the few activities that makes everything else feel correctly ordered. Bryn did not go back to the North Pen. The archive, which is the warmest room in the hold, became his in the afternoons, and the mate mark on my wrist, which I had been told all my life would feel like a claim, felt less like that, and more like the answer to a question I had not known I was asking, close and certain, and, when I thought about it, not new at all, only finally noticed.